Most people pick tech careers completely wrong. They either chase the money and burn out in 2 years, or they pick something chill and just stay broke forever. So I ranked 5 of the biggest tech careers on 2 things that actually matter: how much money you make and whether or not you will hate your life. And the winner might surprise you, because while everyone's fighting over jobs that pay well but destroy their souls, there's one career that gives you both 6 figures and the ability to sleep at night. So I have on screen right now 5 different categories. These are the 5 different fields that we're going to be matching up against each other. So first of all, we have offensive cybersecurity. So by that, I'm talking about things like pen testing and red teaming primarily. We also have defensive cybersecurity, which is a pretty big catch-all. So things like SOC analyst, incident response. I know there's a lot of defensive roles. So we could break all these down granularly, but it would be like way too long of a video. So I'm going to try to strike a nice balance between kind of lumping them, generalizing a little bit, but still keeping it specific enough to where you can walk away with something tangible here. Also, we have help desk. So if you're working like a support desk or something like that, and then system administrator. So if you're like a Linux or Windows admin or backup and recovery, whatever it is, you're administering systems. And then software engineer would be like software developer position. So first of all, let's take a look at offensive cybersecurity in terms of the salary potential. So I'm going to rank them all from S through F, where S is, the highest pay, F is like the worst pay, and S would be, in stress level, would be the least stressful, and F would be like insanely stressful, right? What would I give offensive cybersecurity? Well, with that one, I would definitely have to give it S tier for the salary. There's just so much money that you can make in offensive cybersecurity without even going into a managerial position. If you want to learn more about that, I have a video that I'll put in the cards right now on my own cybersecurity salary journey in offensive cybersecurity. Suffice it to say, insane salary potential there. The next thing that we're going to look at is going to be defensive cybersecurity, which I would also give an S, to be quite honest, because you can make a ton of money in defensive cybersecurity depending on what you do. Now, there's certain roles that maybe your salary would be a little bit more capped, but for the most part, you can make upwards of pretty insane numbers as well. You could definitely stand toe-to-toe, I would say. Maybe if I would have to say, though, on average, if we average offensive cybersecurity roles and average defensive cybersecurity roles, maybe you could argue that, okay, well, defense pays a little bit less because there are some roles that do bring that average down. So if we want to be really nitpicky, we could say like an A on this, but I would say that this should not be a deciding factor between these two. It really comes down to what you want to do the most, because I know people in defensive cybersecurity that are making every bit as much, if not more, than offensive cybersecurity. But on average, let's just call this slightly lower. A help desk, probably the worst in terms of salary out of all the ones that we're looking at here. So just off of that alone, I'm going to give it a D, because that's one of the biggest complaints that I hear from people in the help desk is, yeah, the pay isn't great. And I think, you pretty much all know that. But system administrator is the next one we'll look at in terms of the salary. This one actually has pretty good pay. Let me say, first of all, that the salary is something that we could all point at outliers that break these rules. And you could say like, oh, there's a person here that's making, more than all these other, that can always be the case, but we're looking on average, right? In general, like what is the salary? How would we rate the salary? So for that, we're going to give system administrator a comfortable B, because you can, make some pretty decent money as a system administrator, but in general, it's not as high as what you see in the cybersecurity roles, and also not as high as what you see in software engineer, because software engineers can make quite a high salary as well. I would give it an S, but of course, there's a huge range of software engineers and salaries. So similarly to the defensive side, like it could be A, it could be S. It's kind of the same thing here, where on average, just because there's so many software developers, there's software developers making very little money, and then there's software developers making insane amounts. But overall, I would say this trends slightly maybe above defensive cybersecurity on average maybe, but yeah, it's very comparable. So the winners here would be all 3 of these in terms of the salaries. Now let's look at the stress level, because it's not just about how much money you're making. If you hate your life, who cares if you're making an insane amount of money? If you're having to work like all your waking life and you're always stressed out, then how how valuable is the salary in that case if you can't even live a good life, right? So let's consider that as well. So let's start with offensive cybersecurity. Well, for that, I would honestly say that the stress level is surprisingly low. I would honestly give it an S personally for offensive cybersecurity. Now, I know this can range, and the biggest factor of how it ranges is if you're a contractor versus like an internal pen tester. At some of these contracting companies, it can be a little bit more stressful. So the average might be brought down a little bit by that. But what I'll say is I've always worked on internal pen testing teams. So companies that had in-house pen testers and red teamers, I've always worked on those pen testing and red teaming teams. And in those, it's generally extremely low stress level. You might be watching this and wondering, what do you mean? Everyone told me that cybersecurity is like an extremely stressful job. The reality is, and this is one of the main reasons that I'm going to distinguish between offensive and defensive cybersecurity, because traditionally, offensive security is seen as a proactive role, whereas defensive security is more of a reactive role, right? I would say, let's go to defensive cybersecurity. I would say that that is one of the biggest downsides to defensive cybersecurity is the stress level associated with it. So I will give it a D in terms of the stress level because it's a reactive role, right? We are not in control of when the attackers breach the company, right? That's not something you or I can control. So what happens is, and I've seen this happen many times in my career where I was off for the weekend, right? It was like Friday, it was like Saturday, Sunday. Over the weekend, there was a major breach, like, or even a major new CVE that came out. I remember when the whole Log4j stuff came out, pretty much all of the people that I knew in the defensive side, they were working around the clock. They got called in over the weekend to lock down all the systems, right? Because they can't wait until Monday for that because they're going to be breached by then. So they need all hands on deck to secure that. But I didn't even know that it even happened. Well, obviously I was keeping up with the news. I knew Log4j happened, but I didn't know just how crazy the work schedules were for the defensive guys until Monday when I came in and they're like, oh yeah, I've been working since Friday, And yeah, that's something that I didn't have to deal with as a pen tester, as an offensive security person, because I am on the proactive side. So actually for me, something like Log4j was amazing because then it meant that there's this new vulnerability that I can look for everywhere and I didn't have to work extra hours because of it. There's a lot of stuff like this that makes offensive cybersecurity just so much less stressful of a role than defensive cybersecurity. And now let's look at the help desk. The help desk, it's not overly stressful, but it can be like moderately stressful, especially depending on the company. I can tell you that all my friends that I had on the help desk in my career, they expressed like having way lower working conditions than me. That was something that blew my mind because it's like, here we are working in the same company, but your experience is so vastly different. I'm in cybersecurity and people like my manager is sitting here telling me, hey, I don't care like what hours you work as long as you get your work done. I'm never going to be asking, saying, oh, it's 3 p.m. Where's Ryan? He's like, as long as you get your work done, I don't care. And I thought that was an anomaly that I heard that, but then all three managers that I had, they all said that, like going through my career. I realized like, oh, you just get treated better when you have these like kind of higher tier jobs. Whereas my friends in the help desk, they were in a locked room and they had like some kind of like manager or something like walking around the room, shoulder surfing them, like making sure they're doing their work. They were on the clock. They had to clock in, clock out. And they had very strict, small lunch break they could take. And, it was a vastly different experience than my own. So things like that can increase the stress level for sure. There's probably exceptions to that too. If you're in a help desk that you're in like a night shift or something, maybe it's more chill, maybe it's more relaxed. Like I said, there's always outlier exceptions, but we're looking at in general, like what is the salary, what is the stress level. So I would say in general, it's about average or slightly below average for the stress level there. Next is system administrator. Honestly, I would give this a C/D, let's say. Again, it always depends on the company, but I'll tell you, I knew a lot of system administrators. I used to be one myself on the backup and recovery team. And I would say like one of the most stressful things that, we had to deal with and also people on the Linux and Windows system administration team would have to deal with is patching, right? So when patching happened, that was super stressful. A little bit less so for me on the backup and recovery side, though it was still annoying because if I had to restore some data and they had a patch going on, like, that could affect things. But those guys, like, I remember people on the Windows team, like they would have like their patch month day for the month, and they were working around the clock every time for that. And I remember everyone on the backup and recovery team and these teams, they had like on-call schedules, right? Because especially if you think about what I used to do before, by the way, backup and recovery, essentially taking backups of all the core company data so you can restore it if someone did something stupid, like deleted a bunch of company data on accident or something like that. So I was either their greatest savior or their worst enemy, depending on if I had the backup available and was able to restore it. But that was something that was pretty stressful. And then there were on-call schedules because sometimes, people blow away the data on the weekends, right? Or, sometimes it's not always the user's fault. Sometimes like servers go down and outages happen and stuff and they need to recover data too. That's something that is like, when that happens, people are panicking, right? People are freaking out. It's a pretty high stress environment, even for like more traditional sysadmin roles like Windows and Linux administrators. If like the application teams are dealing with some kind of issue on the server side, they're panicking, they're freaking out because they're like, oh, my app's not working, like there's something wrong with the server. And there's a lot of high stress aspects of these jobs. So that's something that you definitely want to keep in mind, and also know that you could be called over the weekend, or you could be on call, have that on-call schedule. All of these teams pretty much have them. And then the next one is software engineer, about a C as well, because there's a lot of similar things in the software world, right? Like where you have these daily stand-up meetings where people have to just hop on a call and talk about like a bunch of stuff, waste a bunch of your time. They have like so many meetings for software engineers, and that's one of the most consistent things I've heard about like what made the job really annoying. I would say a C overall, but it will range from a D to a B. Right? It depends on where you are in the sprint, because you're going to have a project that's going to have a certain deadline. And when you're on a work sprint, as the name implies, you're really like putting in the hours. You're doing like, in some cases, some pretty crazy hours to meet those deadlines. And when that's happening, I would say the stress level is a D, maybe even an F, depending on what your industry is. Like if you're, let's say if you're in a video game programmer, those people have like the most stressful jobs. Like they're at an F, in those sprints. But then there's times where, the project's on like a slower part of the cycle where it's like a B, even an A, D to A, kind of depending on where you are in the work sprint. But overall, it kind of averages out. We'll call it about a C to a D maybe overall. But yeah, that's what we're looking at in terms of the salary and the stress level. So if we just, say which one's the best for stress level, it's this one. And so out of all of these, the only one that wins on the two categories is offensive cybersecurity, in my estimation, right? Your mileage may vary, but this is what I've observed through my own experience in my 10-year career in cybersecurity, and also working very closely alongside of people in all these positions. Like I said, I was even in a system administration position of my own when I first got started in my career. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, offensive cybersecurity sounds amazing, but how do I actually get there? Well, I've got you covered. I just made a video breaking down the reality of cybersecurity salaries, and what I show might shock you. Most people think that you always start at six figures in cybersecurity. Well, that's not necessarily true, but what is absolutely true is that the salary growth is insane. I'm talking about going from 80K to nearly 200K in just 4 to 5 years, and I will show you my actual W-2s and acceptance letters to prove it. Plus, I reveal some pen testing jobs that are paying well over 400K a year, and you can stay on the technical side to get there. So if you want to see exactly what kind of money you can make in cybersecurity and how fast you can get there, click the video down in the description below, and you'll understand one of the reasons why offensive security is such an amazing field.